Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint the Witherlord from the Rotmire Creed Warband. This is from the new Heart of Ghur box that Games Workshop sent me. You can see, so for this video I've started a little bit differently. The model is completely stuck together. I primed it black and then I gave it a quick zenithal coat using Vallejo neutral grey. And the reason I went for a neutral grey coat rather than white is because I didn't want the colours to be too bright when I paint on top of it, but just having like a slightly lighter colour will kind of get me started on some of the highlights. So I should get a slightly brighter colour, but not so bright that it makes the highlighting too far along, because I want to have more control over that stage later on. And also I find that you get a much smoother finish using a grey spray over using white instead. You can have a very harsh finish if you just go from black to white, whereas the grey is a nice sort of in between. So to start with here, I'm using Deathworld Forest, and as you can see it's quite watered down. You will need to do a few coats. I'm painting this model to a slightly higher standard than normal, so I mean if you just want tabletop stuff you could still perhaps get something from this video, but this is more of a almost display standard, I'd suggest. It is the leader of the squad, so if you want to spend a bit more time on him or just have fun painting something, then it's still like they're ideal techniques to use, but it's not the quickest. So I think this guy, he took me probably 6 hours, something like that, which is quite a lot for a like a single model from a unit, considering that you still have to paint the rest of the squad to go with him. The other thing with this painting is that it can be a little bit fiddly as well. The model in particular, it has a lot of details on. You may have seen on social media that I have painted one of the other models from the Rotmire Creed unit, and that was a bloated one. The bloated one was an easier model to paint. It didn't have quite as many details, so the main thing with this model is that his backpack has lots of things on there, and also on the back of him he's got all these bamboo sticks and things. So there's lots and lots of little details to paint on this, so it slows you down quite a bit, whereas the bloated one had kind of like much larger details, so it was a bit quicker to paint. Whereas for this guy, so that was the first one I painted because I thought that was the model that kind of like captured my interest the most. But when I looked at this guy, I thought he was quite cool in the design work. I particularly liked his helmet. So you can see here I'm painting in the bamboo on his helmet now. I'm not entirely sure how effective his armor and weapons would actually be in reality, but he definitely has a striking appearance. So for all the bamboo, I'm giving it a few coats of Hobgrot hide. That's one of the new Games Workshop colours. And again, you can see as I'm applying it, so the paint is quite watered down. It's around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint, and it does take a couple of layers just to get like a reasonably opaque finish. It doesn't have to be perfectly opaque. And by opaque I just mean it's like a very flat colour that doesn't let any light through. So there is a certain element of translucency still. You might see a little bit of the grey or the white, not the white, the black showing through in the shadows, but generally speaking it's a fairly opaque finish after around about 2 coats, or possibly 3 in a few areas. And the reason it doesn't matter is because we are going to be doing more layers later on, obviously, because it's going to be highlighted up. Another interesting thing for this video, well, maybe interesting, maybe not, is that for a change for me, I'm actually painting most of the model, I say about 90% of it, just using a size 2 brush. So you can see there, the brush is much kind of like chunkier, fatter in the bristle area than I usually use. So I usually use a size 00, and I will, for a couple of little pieces on this, use the same thing. And the only reason I swap over for using the 00 is where it's quite a tight area to get the brush into, and I'm more concerned about catching the brush against other details, and that's always a concern. If you're using a fatter brush, there's a much larger chance of catching other details on models if you're getting the brush into like a tight little area. But the reason, so you can see here as well, I just swapped over a little bit. Well, part of the issue as well for me is because I'm so used to using the 00 is that it takes me a moment to adapt to the size 2. But the nice thing about the size 2 is because it holds more paint, I can cover a large area quicker, and I mean that's like a nice benefit. But the main thing is that you use fewer marks, fewer brush strokes. So you can see here as I'm using the 00, as I'm painting things, I'm going, doing quite a few lots of small marks here as well, because the paint's so watered down. I'm having to remove some of the paint. It'd run into one of the recesses. So although I've used Mournfang brown, and that's going to go for all of the little pot things or whatever they are, the gourds, anything that's leather as well, it's all been given a coat of Mournfang brown. But I just used a little bit of Rhinox hide there just to go into the shadows, because it had run into the recesses there. And I don't really want the... and by running to the recesses, it means that the paint had actually touched some of the Deathworld forest on his little short skirt thing that he's wearing. For the skin here, I'm starting off with Bugman's Glow. And this is a very, very pinky colour. And well, what you'll find is, as I highlight it up, that it stays quite pink, but it gets to a lighter pink. Now... at the very end of the video, and I mean right at the very, very end of the video, I change how the skin looks with a quick grey glaze. It makes a huge difference. It'll be entirely up to you if you want to use that or not. But the thing is with this, so the reason I've gone for Bugman's is that because it's a very sort of reddy pink, it contrasts nicely against the green of the cape. Now, one of the dangers of using red and green contrast, because even though they are contrasting colours, is the implied Christmas theme. If red and green are very strong Christmas elements, but because of the type of green and reds that I've used here, it doesn't give that kind of feel at all. So the colours are quite desaturated and a little bit grubby, especially the green. So it still has the nice contrasting elements, but without looking kind of like obnoxious. Here you can see I'm painting in any of the bone elements, and that's with Balor Brown. And I mean, if you feel lazy, you could either use Balor Brown for the skulls and the kind of bamboo area pieces, or vice versa, because ultimately at the end they'll look very similar when they're all highlighted up, but also because of what I'm going to do towards the end with some more glazing, is it will still separate out the bamboo. However, I do I don't suppose everyone's got Hobgrot hide, but it just has like a slightly different color to the skull, the bone area. So it is quite a nice color to use. I did mention I was doing so there was Mournfang brown for the girds and the leather, but the wood elements are painted Rhinox hide. So that's pretty much just like the whatever it is, the staff, scythe, hook thing with the rope on. That's got the Rhinox hide, and also his shoulder pads. So like all his armor effects, I mean all his armor and weapons and things, kind of like they seem terrible to me, to be honest. But in terms of painting, it's all very simple. So at this stage, it's all been blocked in. Now I'm going to do something a little bit kind of radical. You can see, and if you've seen some of my other videos for painting the Warhammer 30k Space Marine Legions, I like to do this as well. And it kind of has a similar effect to an oil wash. And the reason I'm doing this is because I was like, because of the amount of detail on this model, it takes a long time just blocking all the colours in. And I wanted to get a head start in terms of shading it. So I've taken a size 4 Artis Opus brush, and I've just completely loaded it up, and I'm flooding the whole model with Darkoath flesh. And this is quite a dark colour. The clue's in the name. But it dries, like it's not too dark. It's not a very like it doesn't leave a very hard like dark mark on the model. It's a fairly soft brown, even though it looks quite dark. So it's a bit more translucent than some of the other brown colours. And also I got some contrast medium. So you can see there, as I flooded the model with the Darkoath flesh, I then went back with just the plain contrast medium, loaded up the brush, and then just started flooding that onto the model as well. Really go on there. Don't be shy. Just slap it on there. And then the main point of this is to really focus on the head and chest area, and like some of his like cloak and things like that, just to sort of take off the excess. It is important while the paint is all still wet that you take off the excess, so you look very carefully on the model. So spin it round, look for any kind of build up. Because of the amount that you put on the model, it will tend to flow into all the recesses and things. But the problem is with the way contrast works is if you use a very heavy layer of it, if it goes into say it's a loop, for example, those areas with the rope that he's holding, they're quite small holes, but they're still loops, so you can see all the way through them. If the contrast fills that area, it creates a bubble that fills the area, so you can't push you could push the brush through it because it's only like a thin layer of paint, but it will dry like that. It'll dry as a bubble. So if you leave the paint to dry, you're actually kind of like filling in these areas. So it's quite important that before all the paint dries, you go around, you look for any excess buildup of contrast as you've flooded the model. Then you, with your brush, just dab it on. Like a large brush is best. And again, for when you're flooding the model, I do suggest a large brush. It doesn't have to be an Artist Opus brush, it doesn't have to be a size 4 brush, but like a large brush, just so that you can cover the model quickly before it all dries out. Now, when I painted this, we're having a horrible heat wave in the UK, so the paint is drying even quicker. But even with that, I still found it, reasonably simple to, still cover the model and work with it a little bit before the paint became too dry. You do have to do it quite rapidly, because as soon as it starts to dry, you can't then take any paint off, because it'll leave some of the already dried sections, and then you get like a coffee stain effect between the transition of the wet paint and the dry paint. So now we're getting into the fun painting, and this is the main reason why I wanted to use the larger brush. So these are all going to be really, really soft highlights. I've gone straight in with the Deathworld Forest again, but this has added a small amount of white to it. So if you look on the top left there's the wet palette. So in the bottom left of the wet palette, that's the Deathworld Forest colour. And I've just added a very small amount of white. And when I say a very small, we're not looking for anything like 50-50 or anything like that. It's maybe 4 or 5 parts Deathworld Forest to 1 part white, but maybe even less. I strongly suggest that you test it yourself and see what sort of results you get. The other thing is, this is watered down quite heavily, so this is probably around 2 parts water to 1 part paint. Now, what you're going to find is when you're using a large brush and this very watered down paint, is this could very easily turn into a wash. So you need to kind of like practice your brush control here. It's good practice for this sort of painting. And the nice thing is that with this sort of very thin watered down layering technique, that you do get a very smooth finish. There's not going to be any sort of texture build-up at all, even though it's a light colour. So as we're going to be adding more and more white to this, it's going to be a very light colour that you achieve. Now, one thing that you will struggle with quite a bit is if you want to paint any details. So even though the size 2 brush has a sharp point, and you can see that on there, and I will be trying to paint in some highlights with it, like some sharp detail highlights, because the paint is so thin. And if you push just a little bit too hard, you'll struggle to get a very clean, sharp highlight. So if you want to do a very clean, sharp highlight, you need slightly thicker paint. And I would suggest a thinner brush, just because you take away a little bit more of that risk of accidentally pushing too hard and making a large mark. But for this kind of painting, it allows you to cover a lot of area quickly with fewer brush marks. And so although when you make your mark, it's quite watered down, and it doesn't, you're like, oh, this is horrible, I'm painting a layer down and I can still see the previous layer through, and it doesn't look like a very opaque mark that I'm making. It's going to take a long time, but you can cover all of the areas very, very quickly. They'll all dry, and by the time you finish one area, you get back to another. So you do a few layers and it very quickly builds up. And this is going to be the style of painting that I'm going to be using for pretty much the whole model. So again, I've taken the Deathworld Forest, and this time I've added a little bit more white to it. And so you can see straight away, really, that it's looking lighter. Now, there is you do have to take into account that it looks a lot lighter while it's wet compared to when it dries, and it also looks like you're getting little pools of paint there. It's an important thing to remember that when I'm doing this painting, I'm painting towards the brightest part on the highlight, and so when I remove the brush from the model, it leaves a little deposit of paint wherever you do it. So you can see on these strokes there, as I stop at the bottom and then I lift the brush up, it leaves a little puddle. This is true for all kinds of painting. Wherever you take the brush off, it does leave a little deposit. But the wetter the paint and the more paint there is, the larger the puddle. But because this paint is so watered down, so translucent, you can see it on his sort of loincloth area there as it's drying. It still looks like a puddle, but it's going to keep drying and it's going to get smaller and smaller, and the colour will darken down, and eventually you just won't see it there, and it will just look like a really smooth finish and an even transition. That it won't look like there's a difference, you left a puddle of paint there. You do have to kind of trust that this is going to happen, and not all colours work the same way when you apply them. So some might look darker and then dry lighter, and others look lighter and then dry darker. And this is just down to practice. You just have to kind of use paints, use various mixes, and you'll see what the results will be. But generally speaking, if you've got a paint that's very heavily watered down, when you apply it, regardless of what it looks like when it's wet, it will still blend in quite well to the layer beneath, just because it's so translucent. Like it allows the paint to show through from the layers beneath. So as we're layering up, adding a small amount of white more each time for each successive highlight section, even though it can look quite stark when you first apply the highlight, you already know that it's only a small amount of white that you've added extra from the previous layer. So even though it looks really bright when you first apply the paint, you know that paint is going to dull down to match the layer beneath it that's already dry. So it's just bear all these things in mind. Sometimes it's you can't just paint by looking at what you're doing. You have to just accept that it's going to look a little bit different as it dries. And the other thing, obviously, is getting the position of the highlights right on this as well. For this, I've done fairly straightforward highlight positions. So the chest area, I've given that like that's going to have a slightly stronger highlight because I want the focal point to be on the head and chest area. But most of the cloth area on this as well, it has really nice folds sculpted in. They're quite easy to paint, to get to with the brush as well. So you just paint the bits that are catching the light more. You just hold it under a lamp and see how it's catching the light. If anything looks a bit kind of rubbish with the way the light catches it, then pick the areas that you think will look better with the bright highlight. Don't just be a slave to reality in terms of light placement. You can always add drama by pushing up the focal points on head areas more, dulling down areas like the lower legs and things if you want. You have really sometimes you like seeing old black and white films used to do this really cool thing where the light would hit somebody's eyes and it'd be in shadow on the lower face and the upper parts of the head. It's not really realistic, but it's very dramatic. And in essence, you can do the same thing with model painting. You really draw the focus on where you want people to look, regardless of how realistic it looks. So again, same thing. I just keep adding a little bit more white to it each time. And also, as I do the successive layers, the highlight area becomes smaller and smaller each time. It's hard to see it, I think, maybe in the video with the brush placement because I'm using the larger brush and it's quite quick. But it is a case that as I place the successive highlights on, the amount of area of the model that I paint becomes smaller and smaller, and you get like a really nice soft smooth transition because of the thin paint and the multiple layers. But I think it's a nice effect, and I'm going to be doing more painting like this as well in the future. But it's a nice combination style of paint, so you can have this, combine it with harder styles of painting with very strong texture. So most of the painting on this model is going to be quite soft. It's just that I'm having a bit of fun with it, doing this sort of painting. But if you combine this, like I say, with different texture effects, using slightly thicker paint with harder marks, you can get really nice contrasts in surface texture, which will look great on models in terms of separating out different materials, and again for working in focal points as well. So at this stage now, with we're coming up towards the end of the highlighting section for the green material, and now you have to be a little bit more refined on the brush marks that you're making. And you can see, even though it's behind his weapon a little bit, that I'm using just much more of the tip of the brush. So you can use larger brushes, the same way that you use smaller brushes in terms of details, but you do get kind of like different marks, and it's still making a softer mark. And now obviously bear in mind that I am using thinner paint, so it's going to be a soft mark anyway. But it is nice just for blending small areas. I am painting some Golden Demon entries at the moment, and I've been doing some really fine blending, and I use a combination of a size 00 and a size 2 at the moment for this sort of blending, because it does leave different marks, and with the combination of the two, if you want to get like really perfect transitions, sometimes you want to do really tiny soft marks, or sometimes you want to do slightly larger soft marks, and having the larger brush will make a larger soft mark if you have like the paint thinned down equally for both. And it's partly to do because of the amount of paint that the larger brush also holds, so the way it flows off there. It's just like kind of interesting and different using the two brushes at the same time, even though you're using the same paint, just to see the difference in marks and the sort of like the movements that you make as well. So you, as I said, you can cover a larger area quicker with fewer brush marks using the larger brush, so that will just intrinsically make a very different result to a small brush doing lots of marks on the same area, and you'll get more like a sort of like a soft texture build up. Now you can still do lots and lots of kind of like stippling or like micro stipple glazing type effects with a very small brush, but you could just do one kind of brush stroke with the large brush, and it can have a very similar sort of effect, but be much cleaner in terms of the finish as well. But then a combination of the two, so like even though the large brush can cover a large area, it might not be perfect, you might not catch every single part of it, then you can use the smaller brush to sort of fill in areas as well. For the so we've finished the green areas now on the well, not quite finished, but close enough. And what you'll find is, as I go along with the model, I touch up bits that I spot in between the cuts. So by cuts, like when I edit the video. So every now and then, little bits on the green will change as I tweak it here and there where I'm not happy with bits. But generally speaking, that's how you paint the green. But now we're on to the bamboo sections, and it's exactly the same process as you've just seen with the green material. So it's the Hobgrot hide, and again the first highlight layer was Hobgrot hide plus a very small amount of white, and it's important that it's a small amount of white for the first highlight layer. Remember, so it's already, the whole model's had Darkoath flesh wash all over it. So the base colours, remember the Hobgrot hide was the base colour for the bamboo, but because it's had the Darkoath flesh over it, you could start off with Hobgrot hide straight there, but it's not a big enough jump to make it worth it. Like if you were doing this for a Golden Demon, okay, maybe going with Hobgrot hide, but you probably paint a different style anyway. Maybe, who knows? But it's still, you're not going to be progressing that quickly if you go straight for Hobgrot hide. So just a small amount of white just gives a little bit more of a tonal jump for the first stage highlight, so you can kind of like just see that you're actually making a difference on the model. And again, you're looking for highlight placement here. Always like make the brush stroke finish on the highest part of the highlight. Now in this case, the highest part of the highlight is around about a third from the left of center. But most of the bamboo on the left hand side of the hat, it gets covered still on the first sort of pass. On the right hand side, there's only about halfway. Then, and from that halfway point, the highlight is dragged towards the front of the head helmet thing. And kind of the one important thing to bear in mind, and the bamboo is the most irritating part to paint on this model. But to bear in mind is because you're using such watered down paint and there are a lot of recesses on the bamboo, if you touch the brush into the recesses, those areas will flood. It's going to look even worse while the paint's wet because the recess will then look brighter than the raised area because the paint will all just like the capillary action will draw all the paint and pigment into the recess, and because it's concentrated in that little recess, it does actually make it look more highlighted than the flat sort of curved area that you've put the original highlight on. However, as it dries, it will all even out a little bit more and it won't be quite as extreme. However, I do suggest that if you do catch the paintbrush into those recesses, that you quickly rinse off your brush. So you've got a fairly large brush there, a size 2. Rinse it all off, dry it out, and then touch it onto the wet area that's had a recess in. So you've got to do this quite quickly before the paint dries, especially in the weather that we've got at the minute in the UK. You can see there actually how I've done that myself. I've just got some of the paint into the recess. I'm just going to cut the video, stop the video, because I had to quickly sort that out. But so you've cleaned off your brush, just touch where the paint has gone into the recess, and it'll just all the paint will flood straight back into the brush, and you'll fix that issue. For painting the wood here, again pretty straightforward. So starting off with Mournfang brown this time. So this is a little bit different to the other colours, which have just used the same base colour that we started with before the Darkoath flesh. So in terms of the green material that he's wearing, that was Deathworld Forest, and then that's just been highlighted up afterwards using Deathworld Forest and white. Same with the bamboo, that was Hobgrot hide, highlighted up with white. For the wood, this was painted with Rhinox hide to start with, but so the first highlight that I'm doing with this is Mournfang brown mixed with a small amount of white. So this is slightly more significant jump in terms of like the brightness, but because I'm still using the larger brush, I can make a softer mark still. The highlight points are more focused towards the central part of each section of wood, so you can see it's got those spikes on. Wherever the wood touches those, just leave it a little bit dark. Still pick out the details, but so you can see they're like picking out the wood grain and things going up to those spikes, but the general bulk of the highlight is in the central part of the wood. And again, I've just added a bit more white again to the Mournfang brown. You can see it starts to look like a sort of like a pinky kind of fleshy colour, pinky browny. It's quite a nice colour. Maybe not necessarily that much like wood, but again, the look of the whole model that I'm going for is quite desaturated and a little bit sort of pastely as well. Because I'm highlighting up each colour in the same way, so just highlighting it up with white and using the same sort of techniques on all the areas, the whole of the model will sort of homogenize with the style. It'll all look like it all works together in terms of lighting and atmosphere, which is quite an important thing really to get right on a model if you want a sort of a more realistic look, because the colour of the light, like the natural light that's hitting the model, would be relevant to all elements on the model in terms of highlights. Now if you're doing more of say an heavy metal style of painting, or more kind of distinctive, bright and vivid, without paying that much attention in terms of lighting, then you can have different coloured highlights. So for example, you could have red highlighted with orange, blue highlighted with white, something highlighted, whatever colour you want, highlighted in a different way. But using, say, going with that style, the colours will be very vibrant. They could almost be jarring in some ways, but they won't work together in terms of atmosphere and lighting, because if you highlight red up with yellow, then everything on the model should be highlighted up with yellow, because it would be a yellow light that's hitting it, if that makes sense. Whereas if you have a white light hitting it, then the red would have to be highlighted up to a pinky colour. But it will be dependent on how you actually apply that in terms of the light placement that makes it look correct as a red colour and not just be pink. So that's why on this, I'm just using white highlights on everything, just highlighting up, through all the different stages, and it makes everything coherent as a whole piece, because everything looks very, very similar in terms of highlights. I will also be doing a little bit at the end as well, with some very quick glazing, just to tie the whole model together even more with the sort of the green elements. So the thing with these guys is they live in a swamp. I think that's why he has stilts as well. I'm not sure how effective stilts would be in reality in terms of living in a swamp. I would have thought it would actually be impossible to walk through a swamp with stilts, but I can understand the concept is so that you don't sink down, or you stay above the soft layer and the water. But regardless, they're living in a swamp, so there's going to be lots of green and mold, and that works really nicely along with the Nurgle theme. Now, I don't think these guys technically worship Nurgle, but they do have, they do worship Nurgle, but they don't understand it as Nurgle. It's like a variation of Nurgle. And you can sort of see that in terms of his little friend that sits on his shoulder. That I think would be a version of a Nurgling, but his is a toad, and a toad with 3 eyes, and that's quite a strong symbol of Nurgle in itself. The 3 eyes on the face. So all really cool little details. But yeah, I will be kind of pushing the Nurgle element with sort of a green sickly colour, very subtly added all over the model as well. Now we're getting onto the flesh. Now I talked about this a little bit earlier. What you'll find is, just to reiterate, I'm using Bugman's Glow, and then so this first highlight is Bugman's Glow mixed with a small amount of white. So you should be able to figure this out by now. This is going to be the same for all the colours. And again, the highlight position is, you hold it under a lamp or whatever, or just look at the model naturally and see where the light falls, and then decide if that lighting is suitable for what you want. For me on this, I'm making the highlights near the top of the bicep connecting to the forearm there as the brightest part. So that might not be quite the same as how it falls under the lamp, because it would just be a very generic highlight going across the arm. All the highlights would be very similar in brightness, whereas I will just be pushing it a little bit higher on that connecting point there. But it's still holding the model under the lamp gives me a good indication of where the light placement would be. I'm painting the little toad thing in this, or to start with, the same colour as the skin, although later on the skin will be separated out and look reasonably different in the photograph at the end. But just because, and it's also an important thing to remember, just because the primary highlight stages all look the same doesn't mean to say it's going to look the same at the end, because just very small things can really change how the colours look, and hopefully you will see that. But it's pretty straightforward on this. The Bugman's Glow with the small amount of white, it is quite a big tonal jump. I probably could have actually done this one with straight Bugman's Glow to start with as the first highlight. I think you can see there how sort of dark and red coloured the skin looks, and part of that is down to, because Bugman's Glow is already quite a dark red colour anyway, and then having the Darkoath flesh on top of that, the wash, really reinforces that colour, because it's very similar, with that reddy brown colour. So actually, it works more for darkening down the skin than it does maybe on the sort of the bamboo areas. But I think ultimately at the end, the highlights are still pretty smooth in the transition, so it's not a big deal. If you wanted, you can paint the veins as a nice blue colour on the arms. Not necessarily realistic, but it suits it quite nicely in terms of the sort of like Nurgle rotting effect. If you look at the bloated one that I painted on my social media, you'll see that I did actually paint some freehand veins on the model, and it looks really cool, because it stands out, makes it look a bit more rotten. The bloated one has more obvious skin lesions and just general nastiness all over him than the leader here. But this does still have some on. What you might be thinking at the moment is that this looks way too sort of pinky and healthy for a Nurgle model, and I mean, you're kind of right, but that's because again I'm going to be changing the look of the skin later on. I'm not going to change it for the toad though. I kind of thought it'd be fun just to have the toad in sort of pinky looking, healthy looking skin, whereas the guy that he's riding on actually looks quite poorly in terms of like having a sort of a grey pallor to his skin. Also on this, you haven't seen me paint them, but you can see these little blobs. So on his shoulder and on his rack on the back, these little pink sort of like I say, blob things. I don't know exactly what it is. I looked on the box art and they painted those green, so I guess it's some sort of mold or fungus or whatever. But I just thought it'd be fun to paint them as blobs of flesh. So that's what they are. They're painted in the same way as the rest of the skin on him. And I kind of find that sort of more horrific looking. But you're free to paint them however you want. It might be more interesting to have them as a green colour. For these highlights here, you can see more now what I was talking about, where especially on the forearm section, that how the brightest highlight is at the top on the muscle on the forearm. And here you can see the highlights on his little toad friend as well. And for most of the highlights, these are just going to be the upwards facing folds on his I guess fatty lumpy bits. But also try and capture some of the expression on the shape of the toad, because he's sort of quite disdainful looking, I find anyway, and that's how I painted him. And one thing that I missed off the video is actually how to paint his eyes, so I'll go over that now. I didn't show how to paint them because his eyes are actually quite small and you can't see that much with how I paint them. But this is pretty straightforward. So I just paint the eyeballs yellow using Yriel yellow, then black dot in the center, and then a white dot inside the black dot. So very, very straightforward. No highlights in terms of like any sort of reflections on the yellow or shading or anything like that. But because the eyes are so small, it still works quite well anyway. Again, you'll see at the end in the photograph. So this is the final stage highlight of the flesh, and you just want to be a little bit more careful with how you apply this. I mean, obviously, as you go through the stages of the highlights, each successive layer, you need to be more and more careful each time, because the detail and finish becomes much more important. The first layers, you're just using very broad brush strokes, but with each successive layer, the marks get smaller, more precise in where you place them, so that the highlights exactly on the brightest part where you want them to be. And also just like taking a moment to think if highlighting a certain place will actually make an improvement. So here, for example, you saw I put a highlight just underneath the eyeball, which will then draw focus towards that eye as well, as a slight focal point. And you also might find that you need to go over a couple of these layers just a few times, because again, remember, this is like fairly heavily watered down. You might notice on the wet palette the paints are drying out really quickly. My room is obnoxious to painting. It's probably 40 degrees when I was painting this, so the paint was, even though like just a small drop of water reactivates the paint on the wet palette, but because I'm not using massive amounts of paint and it's very watered down, so it's also worth bearing in mind, if you heavily water down paints, they dry out quicker. Oddly enough, but it kind of like, because it spreads them out faster as well, so you get a larger surface area, which means that the paint dries quicker. But yeah, anyway, so onto the and you can see here I've just painted in the eyes quickly on the toad, as I was mentioning. So onto the bone areas, and this is similar sort of thing that you've already seen all over. So we originally painted the bone areas with Balor Brown, gave it a wash of Darkoath flesh. Now we're back to Balor Brown. So I haven't gone straight in and used the white in it as well. It does depend on which colour you're using as to whether you can really get away with the first stage highlight of adding white or not. In this one I chose not to. The main reason for that is because I want to get to the highlights on this quite I'm going to make the highlights quite small, and the reason for that is because there's a lot of bamboo on this model, and the colours, although they're dissimilar to start with, so the Hobgrot hide and the Balor Brown, they look quite different when you first apply them to the model, but as you highlight up and you add lots of white to both of them, they start to look very, very similar. And if I kept the bone with the size of the highlights to be the same as the bamboo areas, you have a hard job differentiating between the two. Now that might be realistic. They're probably very similar colours in real life, but I just wanted on the model to have a distinct difference between the two surfaces. So you can see there I've just added a small amount of white now to the Balor Brown, but what I'm actually doing more importantly is on the highlight placement, I'm keeping the highlights quite small. I'm still using the size 2 brush, by the way, but just not adding very much paint to it, so you can just see it's just only the tip of the brush that's holding the paint. One thing with using larger brushes is, especially if there's very watered down paint, if you put a lot of paint on the brush, what happens is that you lose the tip. The brush will sort of like, it'll hold a lot of paint, but it will flood the front of the brush, because when you hold the brush down, the gravity will draw the paint towards the tip, and so it sort of flares out. That's a strong indication if you touch the model with that amount of paint on it, it's just going to completely flood the area. So it's usually better to, even if you've got a larger brush, to not have too much paint on it. But what you can do is, when you've loaded up the brush, if you just touch it to like some kitchen roll or whatever, it'll take off all the excess, but there's still quite a lot of paint within the belly of the brush, so you can carry on painting, but it still gives a different result. Like it still will give it'll apply more paint, and it'll be like a little bit more watered down almost. Well, this is what I've been finding anyway. In comparison, if you just use a small amount on the tip of the brush, I think this is probably down to the drying time. So if there's only a small amount of paint on the tip of the brush, that will dry quickly, whereas if there's quite a lot of paint in the belly of the brush, then because it's a larger amount of fluid, it won't dry as quickly. So again, just testing these things will give you different results. Again, next stage of highlight on the bone is a bit more white to the Balor Brown, and again smaller areas as well. So basically what I want is to be able to see more of the brown element of the Balor Brown on the model, whereas on the all the bamboo areas, there's more highlights visible. So part of the thing with that as well is that it's not necessarily realistic, really, the way that the surface, like the shininess on each surface, is not going to be that dissimilar between bone and bamboo. So the size of the highlights and like the look of the highlights should be fairly similar, really. But I'm purposefully changing them so that they don't look the same, just because I want to make the materials look different on the model, because I wanted the skull to stand out a little bit as being different. One slight negative I found on the sculpt with the skull at the front is it looks a little bit flat at the back. I'm assuming that the back of the skull is chipped off or something, because it would, I don't know, it would be a bit weird having the curve resting against his chest. But I don't know, I think it looks more strange having it flat at the back, because it sort of, the sculpt then sort of kind of almost merges with the green material area. I would have liked a little bit more of a separation between the two pieces. It's also quite strange having the three gouges, I think, or claw marks in the skull. So when I painted the bloated one, he's got a very similar skull on him, and it has the same three sort of gouges. I probably need to read a bit more of the background to check this. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a Nurgle thing or something. I don't know. But a lot of the models seem to have this on them, and I don't really know why. But you know, I don't know. It seems a bit strange to me anyway. One other just little thing just before I move on, or a bit late, but on the skull you can see there, so painted in the teeth, and I've not highlighted the teeth all in the same way. I see this quite often where people just highlight each tooth in turn, just doing the same highlights on each one. If you focus on the front teeth, and you get it to a smaller and smaller area each time, so eventually the final highlights are just the front two teeth, it'll make it look more like the front of the face is highlighted, and it curves around into shadows at the side. For the leather and the gourds, I'm going back to Mournfang brown, so ignore the colours on the wet palette; those are wrong. That was from the skull there, but on the gourds there, it's Mournfang brown with a small amount of white again, and so as I said, this is for the leather as well. They're painted in slightly different styles. So the gourd is going to be quite smooth with some like nice round highlights. The leather is going to be more scratchy. I'm also going to paint the wrappings on the leg sort of leather, but they're going to be over highlighted. It just make them look like a slightly different colour as well, or it's like a slightly different material maybe, but using the same colours. So even though you can just use the same paint, basically I was being lazy at this point, but you can use the same colours and still achieve different effects on all of them. For the gourds here, the highlights, it's quite important that you get like a nice round highlight on the sort of the upper left area. I quite often do my highlights from the upper left, just because it's easier for me to film that way, and I quite like the look of it anyway, so it's like slightly off center. But you're welcome to do whatever direction highlighting you like. I know a lot of people like just a straight top down highlight as well. I'm going to be painting lots of texture on these. It's slightly out of focus, but I think you'll get the idea on these wrappings around his leg. And so again, it's just Mournfang brown with a small amount of white. Focus. So with these wrappings, what actually happens is that it's sort of recessed in the center, and then at the top and the bottom they come more outwards. For the lower section of that, paint like quite a strong highlight, and then on the upper edge paint a strong highlight, and then just do lots and lots of lines and make the lines quite visible as well, connecting between the top and the bottom, but then get the lines closer together at the sort of the front facing part of the wrapping. So this is kind of like similar to what I just mentioned about the teeth on the skull. So the teeth, obviously the brightest parts are in the furthest forward. Same again for the wrapping, the brightest highlights are on the furthest forward part. This will give the impression that they sort of fold around at the sides into shadows. You're still painting like highlights on them all the way around, but just there's a stronger highlight at the front, just gives the model a bit more depth. Also with the marks, make sure when you're doing them, it's always drawing the brush mark towards you. If you paint upwards, I mean, it's not going to make a massive amount of difference on this tiny little area that you're painting on, but if it's a larger mark, painting away from yourself, you're asking for a world of hurt in terms of the brush not doing what you want, so the tip is likely to splay out, or like, you just make a mess with it. So you can see there, I've been and carried on doing the highlights on other parts of the model as well. So you've got the goods on the back on his little backpack thing. Those have been highlighted up with they've already been highlighted with this current highlight layer that I'm applying to this one here. It's just like a small amount of white extra on the previous highlight, and you're just going over the top of the highlights that you've already painted on, but in a smaller area. Again, you can still see I'm using this size 2 brush. Now, you don't have to use that if you don't want to. It does get a little bit more irritating, I suppose, in that there's a stronger chance I could catch some of the other parts of the model that I've already painted at this stage. But I tend to find that I could just paint a little bit longer, having the larger brush, and it does still make a softer mark. But, it's not a vast difference for this sort of smaller detail area. If you feel more comfortable, then by all means go back to the size 00 as well. And in some cases I do, just because it can be more irritating risking catching parts of the model. The main thing that I actually found for keeping the larger brush was I could mix the paint on the wet palette with it, or just add a bit of water, because obviously it holds a lot more water than the size 00. So as the paint was drying, I could quickly dip the brush into the water pot and add like a significant amount of water in one go. However, I strongly suggest you do not do that with your nice quality brushes. It will get paint into the ferrule, so the metal part of it, really quickly. It'll ruin them much quicker. My suggestion would be, and this is usually what I do, I was just again wanting to get through things quicker, but what I usually do is I have an old brush spare that I use for mixing paint on my wet palette. That will save your brush a lot. If you keep mixing paint with the brush that you're painting with, you're rapidly reducing the lifespan of the brush. One little thing that I didn't tell you about painting, so if you see on his weapon there, it looks a little bit ropey from this angle, but he's got like a sort of a big needle gun, something. I guess he injects you with Nurgle's rot or something. But so it's made of bamboo as well, but it's got these little ridges on. If you paint the ridges as bright highlights, so you highlight it up to the same way as you did on the bamboo on his helmet, and then you don't leave them, but you only do like one layer of highlight. So you just go with, say, Hobgrot hide, and just do sort of like streaking lines on there. It makes it look strongly like there's shadows and then lights catching the raised areas. It's quite a nice little effect. There you can see I'm just painting in the leather as well. It's not the best colour for leather, this, just going with Mournfang brown, adding white. Normally I would add like a bit more of an orangey kind of colour to the leather, but as I mentioned, I was being a bit lazy. But also I did intend at the end with a bit of glazing, just to separate out a lot of the areas as well, or just add a bit of colour into places, and you'll see how that turns out. But here you can see the sort of like the final highlights on the wrappings as well. So these are obviously highlighted much brighter than you should be for leather, and it looks more like a sort of a material kind of wrapping. But I think that works a bit better. But it looks fine anyway, regardless. All right, so for the base, I'm just doing the base the same way as I did for the bloated one as well. It's a bit different in terms of he's on stilts, so it maybe should be a bit deeper and darker. All it is Deathworld Forest and black, so I'm using Vallejo model colour black, but it doesn't really matter. And just blend the colours together on the base, so some areas are lighter and some are darker, but it's all blended together. Stick on your preferred tufts of grass, The reason I say that is so I'm using this product called Mod Podge. It's just sort of like a really thick gloss varnish, and you just slather it on there, and when that dries, it'll have like a nice. It does take quite a while to dry, even in hot weather, but that as you touch the tufts of grass. So I didn't actually bother gluing these on. Like, they do have a certain element of glue on them already. But as it dries, it will sort of seep in there and it will attach the grass tufts pretty strongly. Also, while it was wet, I sprinkled on some kind of broken up tea leaf bits as well, just to give the impression of stuff in the swamp, and stuck on a couple of bits of greenery. But yeah, so you can see it's a very quick and simple base. For these spikes, this is just some Rhinox hide. It's quite thinned down, around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint, and this is just some glazing towards the tip so that it gets darker at the tip, and it'll be lighter where it connects to the wooden shaft of the weapon. I also actually, I haven't shown you in the video, but if you look on the rope that is also holding, that's attached to the weapon with the hook, I've done a little bit of Rhinox hide glazing in some of the recess parts on that as well, just to give that a bit of depth and make it a bit more interesting. I got a bit bored actually painting the rope. I think you can see it's not had as much detail painted onto it as some of the other parts, but it still does the job anyway. Also on those spiky bits, if you want to get the tip really dark, then again just take some, so you can take Vallejo model color black, but actually in this case I prefer to glaze with Abaddon black. It really doesn't matter too much, but you'll get a slightly more satin finish with the Abaddon black, which will actually make it look darker at the end, because it's a very tiny sort of sheen to it, like having a shiny surface just makes a color brighter or stronger. Then I'm just using some Balor brown here just to paint on the lower sections of these spikes. I'm only just going to take these up to Balor brown, so I'm not taking these any higher than that as a highlight, but it just gives a little bit of contrast between the light and dark, but also separates these spiky bits out. I think they're a different material to the wood. There might be horns or something like that. So here we are nearly finished on the model. There's a couple of things here that I've done extra. So I glazed on some Rhinox hide onto the end of his cloak, and also on the thingy loinclothy material, or it's not even that, it's like a poncho, I think. But yeah, so just glaze starting about a third halfway up and then dragging the brush down towards the tip. If you also want, you can add some black again to the very bottom of that, and also put a couple of dots of paint of Rhinox hide just to give the impression of mud spatter if you want. The non-metallics for the hook, this is very, very simple. I went straight in with neutral grey. So obviously when I painted that, it was a black primer, it had a zenithal spray with some neutral grey, and then it got covered in Darkoath flesh, so it's already a little bit grey and browny. So the first highlight of neutral grey, it's not going to make a massive impact, but it still puts some nice highlights on there. And again, you're just looking for where the light naturally falls. Because it's a hook, it has some really nice curves on it. It's quite simple to paint to make it look shiny and non-metallic. Just make sure the light gathers in the curves, and just do a couple of layers so you get a nice opaque finish. Add a bit more white to it, so you're going to go through, you can see there I've been a bit lazy and I've just smeared the paint along to so I can get a few different variations of grey into the transitions. Make sure the tip of the hook is also highlighted, but it's basically that curve at the bottom, the nice circle element to the hook, that gives the strongest indication that it's supposed to be a metallic area, because the light just falls so nicely on that shape. Also, while you're doing the hook, you might as well finish all the other little metal parts of the model as well. Now if you want and you feel like the hook looks a little bit too plain in terms of it's not got enough grime or rust on it, then you can go back with some Mournfang brown and just sort of glaze that into the shadows. That will make it look a little, quite a lot grimy. If you want it to look rusty, you can stipple on some Troll Slayer orange, maybe some Fire Dragon Bright as well. Just be a bit careful with that because it can have quite a strong impact. But as long as you do it with stippling technique, it'll look sort of more like a build-up. But if you ever go too strong with that, you can again glaze over that with some of the Rhinox hide as well, and it'll just keep it like sort of grimy, rusty looking. But I wasn't too bothered about that. I do actually, I think at some point, so I just go over the model with some Rhinox hide, just looking for a few areas where I can quickly just shade it down a little bit here and there if I feel something looks a bit unfinished. Rhinox hide is really nice for that, especially because of the way that I've painted this model, and because I, with the Darkoath flesh with that sort of browny element to it. So if you take Rhinox hide that's watered down a bit, you can use it as a glaze and just to go into any sort of shaded areas. So quite a few people asked about the flesh and how I got that really lovely colour and make it look so ill looking. All I've done is taken the neutral grey that I had on the wet palette, watered it down so it's around about 3 parts water to 1 part paint. I just glazed over all the mid-tone and shadow elements, not going over the highlights too much, but going from the highlights and basically covering the rest of it. Really knocks back any of the red element on the flesh colour, and just makes him look really quite poorly, but it's a nice effect as well, and it really strongly separates out the flesh from the pinky look on the toad as well. So the final thing that I'm going to be doing with glazing, and I wish I'd put this on the wet palette, but I've got some Moot green. Now you have to be really careful with this, and it has to be really, really watered down. So we're looking like 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint. But this is just going to add like a little green touch to all the parts on the model. So you're not flooding it, but you just it can go into recesses as well. Obviously, mold and slime and stuff gets into recess areas, but this is just giving that sort of swampy look to him. So there's like green build-up everywhere. It is a case of less is more. If you put too much on this, you're just going to end up with a green model, and it won't look very good. But if you just put it in like the recesses, parts where things touch each other, little bits here and there, just give everything pretty much just a slight little touch of green. And it'll look stronger when you first touch it with a brush. Remember, this is very heavily watered down, but you don't want much on your brush when you're doing this. Because it's a size 2 brush, when I've done this, you can do pretty much the whole model with this effect just with one refill of the brush. So as long as you work pretty quickly and don't let the brush completely dry out. But there you go. And here's the final shot of it. So I think you can see more there now, some of the green elements and how they work, and how the grey on the flesh as well really separates it out, especially from the flesh of the toad. And by the way, the slime coming out of the toad's mouth, that was also painted with Moot green and then highlighted up with white. So that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Please remember to subscribe. I have quite a few more videos to come, including all of the Space Marine Legions as I get around to them. And also don't forget that I have my Patreon and my personal website, which have a lot of videos, and I'm just about to upload another video for that, which will be my Sikaran I painted. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.